Okay, we seem to be roughly around about the right attendance level relative to the sessions we had yesterday. So morning everyone. Welcome to session 3 of 4 of the SIT retrospectives. We had 2 sessions yesterday, one covering CIT, SIT-F and SIT-M, and then a session in the afternoon covering settlement testing. The session focus today is SIT, NFT and PIT. As was the case in the previous sessions, we want you to consider your positive and negative experiences. So what went well, what didn't go so well, how items raised impacted you as participants individually, how you felt that impacted the program on a broader sense, and then looking for constructive suggestions on how things could be done differently in future programs. So we're looking the approach to the discussion. We're looking for the discussion to be constructive and consider what we've learned on this MHHS SIT journey. So through the full testing life cycle from PIT through to SIT conclusion. The focus areas for each session are fairly loose in structure. So we're just using that to kind of drive out the discussion in these broad focus areas. But if you do want to raise anything more generally about the SIT process, you can raise that in any session. If you want to raise an item, you can raise your hand in Teams, and then we'll come to you one by one. And we want you to consider the whole life cycle, as I say, so from test cases and data, test process, engagement and communications, test tooling and reporting, and anything generally you want to bring into the mix. In these sessions, if the conversation reaches a natural conclusion, we will wrap up, but we will hold the subsequent session. So if there's anything we didn't get to or you think about after this session, you can raise it in the last session. And of course, once the sessions are concluded, you can also email into the test mailbox. Post sessions, we will share the recordings and transcripts. We'll also provide a summary of themes, and we'll play that back in an appropriate industry forum, so either GLIG or PSG, for instance. And then the lessons that are logged from these sessions will feed into a blueprint for subsequent industry programs document. Beyond testing, there are obviously other work streams in the program. So towards the end of the program, a document will be produced, which will then feed into support the planning for future industry programs of this type. So today, as I say, the focus is NFT. I'm personally going to be dropping out at 9:30. I've got to join a pub call. I've got my colleague David O'Riordan to drive the discussion around NFT, and Raki is also on the call to talk about PIT. So I think on that basis we can kick off. So I'll open the floor. Who wants to be the first to raise their hand? Joe, hi.
Hi, morning. Yeah, just a couple of points from the Kraken side. First of all, I think around NFT, the communication around it was quite good, and you guys were always on hand and approachable. And we had consistent touch points, which I feel was really important with what was quite an intensive period of testing. So that was really appreciated, and I do thank you for that. I think the main feedback from myself would be I thought in the end that the way of measuring success with NFT probably wasn't quite fit for purpose. I'll try and explain what I mean. So when we had like one sheet per cohort that covered all the flows that we were sending and receiving for every party, I thought that when we were getting caught up in the granular detail far too easily. So what ended up happening was when we felt that we had to account for every flow that we were sending and receiving, we'd get bogged down in quite granular detail around certain specific MPANs, and we'd lose the bigger picture slightly. And it meant that we were struggling to spin all the plates that we were trying to spin.
Okay.
What I would suggest next time is splitting the testing up by tests a little bit more and having one source of truth across the cohorts for MPANs being used. And that would have made life just a little bit easier, I feel, for monitoring purposes, accountability, and everyone knows if there's a problem with the test data and doesn't have to sort of independently investigate it. And then we can focus on the main point of NFT, which is the load testing side of it, rather than getting bogged down in the detail.
Okay, so in terms of getting bogged down, was it that you were impacted or experiencing issues that were related specifically to data or functionality, and that was making it difficult to see the criteria that you were driving for in the test stage?
Yeah, the majority of the more granular details were due to test data problems, and they didn't affect like the majority of the data. It was just those few MPANs. But what happened is we were only aware of those when we saw that our numbers weren't tallying up to the totals that were expected, and we had to sort of conduct an investigation into that, and we found that it was test data issues on the whole. And it just meant on a human level, with it being such a period of intense testing, that we didn't have as much time to dedicate to other things, and it was just quite difficult to keep track of everything when we were doing that.
Okay, so one of your suggestions there is that the granularity of the test cases could be considered differently next time, but the test data side of things, sorry, I wasn't as close to this. David, have you got any commentary around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we certainly found there were some issues with the test data set that was provided, which caused some quirks with some of the processes that we were executing. I absolutely take your point. There was an element of, we're trying to do this activity in the large, but then we ended up getting bogged down in some of the lower level details with individual processes not quite executing 100% correctly. I guess it's difficult in that, we were trying to do this big bang type approach in terms of, well, how can we validate that we think everything's working correctly? Well, if everything reconciles correctly, then we know it's worked correctly, right? But then as soon as it didn't quite 100% reconcile, we ended up at that challenge of, well, now we've got to dig into it a bit to try and understand, well, is this an issue with the system? Was it an issue with data? Was it an issue with how a process ran? So on and so forth. It certainly became a challenge, but, I guess the difficulty is that it's kind of hard to decompose that because, as distinct from functional tests, where we're looking at one very specific aspect of functionality, I guess an element of the non-functional testing is that it is about all of these concurrent activities, happening all at once, essentially. So if there's an issue with any one of them, we do have to dig into them. Obviously, then that's layered on with further complications of it's everybody doing all of these activities at the same time as well. So if there is an issue with some element of the data, we were finding that was perhaps impacting more than one participant. There's multiple investigations going on simultaneously. We're trying to touch base with all these, individual participants at the same time to get to the bottom of root causing these problems. I guess part of this was also driven by the fact that we knew we were working with certain time constraints in terms of the window that we had for exclusive access to the environment. So yeah, I certainly accept that it certainly made things more pressurized, and there was that possibility of getting lost in the weeds a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But
how much of moving to testing in SIP B was a function of some of these problems in the early stages as well? Was that a factor that was at play?
Sorry, is that a question for me or for Joe?
Yeah, just generally, really. But was that a significant factor as well at the early stage of testing?
Well, I think we're always aware that every time we switched environments, every time we did a new data load, there always seemed to be some quirks that came out of the woodwork. The process would never just 100% perfect every time. So I guess that certainly probably added a little bit of extra noise once we did, move to that new environment.
Okay.
Yeah, that's definitely something we found, because what happened is if we had MPANs that had been used before in a different environment, then our system thought that it had, for example, change of agents in motion already. So that was extra red tape that we needed to remove, reset the data on the day itself. That was another hurdle in, again, quite a intensive period of testing. So yeah, the switching of environments was providing some challenges around that as well.
All right, thanks, Joe. All right, we've got some more hands up, so we'll move on. Sean, hi.
Yeah, so from our point of view, non-functional, we were really struggling with why we were running it. So listening to what David and Joe were saying, there was a lot of concurrent processes and a lot of concurrent messages flying through SIT A due to the amount of testing that was going on at SIT A. We'd done PIT proving that we could process hundreds of thousands of files a day, and then we were doing 20 ampans per test. And we were meeting all of the 60 minutes within SIT, and we're all providing evidence to that. I think the only test that actually proved was useful and non-functional was the back off and retry, which I think could have been done in SIT A if we'd agreed with the program that we were going to do while the DIP was down doing a deployment. Otherwise, yeah, it was. We really struggled with why we were doing non-functional. It felt as if it was a draw on resource and time that, in several ways, from what I've said, what wasn't necessary, and that was our view. The final point I just want to make before you come back in, David, is we were also slightly worried when we found out that the DIP in SIT B was struggling when we found out that one of our participants, all they could do to send 21s was they would send all the ampans they've got loaded, which was 1,000, and that seemed to be maxing out the DIP in SIT B, which then again gives me the question of how is this a fair replication of non-functional testing and live when everyone will have done their PIT to hundreds of thousands and millions of messages?
So I think what we need to be kind of clear is, I guess, regarding the non-functional testing, specifically what the goals were for each of the different phases. So, I absolutely take your point that in thinking of traditional non-functional testing, you're thinking that's your production-like volumes going through, pushing the system to its limits and so on and so forth. For theme 1 that we did, which was the DIP Helix integration, that was certainly what was the case, and we were exercising full production volumes. But with the approach for the program, there was always this distinction between, for individual participants, full volume testing could only happen in their individual PIT phase because of the fact the challenge there was in terms of creating industry aligned data across all participants to create an actual production scale set for that was just deemed something that wouldn't be possible, or at least not possible in a reasonable amount of time to align with program plan timelines. So when it came to this idea of this integrated test for theme 2, and I know you alluded to the theme 3, the back off and retry, and certainly I accept perhaps that could have been done in a different environment, but we ended up doing it in SIT B, I guess because of the fact that it was felt you'd have more control over the DIP and you wouldn't be impacting other ongoing testing activities. But theme 2, I think, is the one where we probably had the most headaches, and as obviously with everyone working concurrently in the same environment, but at reduced volumes. And we always knew that the SIT B DIP instance would not have to be production scaled because we would not be putting production scale volumes through it. The goal of that testing was not so much about production level volumes going through that system. It was much more about this idea of kind of coexistence. So when participants start to roll onto the DIP, you're going to have multiple participants interacting with the DIP at the same time. The idea of coexistence is to make sure that, well, if more than one participant is interacting with the DIP at the same time, how do we know that they're not going to be impacting each other? How do we know that they're not going to be blocking each other? Are there going to be race conditions? That sort of stuff. I guess that was more the goal of the theme 2 testing, was this idea of, can we have multiple participants coexisting against a single DIP instance, and that it's not going to cause issues for processing of each individual participant's messages flowing back and forth, which of course is something that you could not do in your own PIT phase because you would be totally testing your PIT phase. You would be totally testing in isolation. So that's where it was seen that the extra benefit was going to come from the theme 2. But I certainly accept that we had challenges when it came to executing it. Definitely.
Thanks, David.
Does that kind of address your question a bit, Sean?
Yeah, other than we were doing that in set A because we were all doing concurrent testing at exactly the same time in set A. So that's you kind of answered it. But yeah, if that had been made more clear, I was struggling to justify to the people above me of what this phase was. So yeah, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Julia,
I see this.
Julia,
Sorry, yeah.
Julia, I don't know whether you're talking away me there.
Sorry, Dom. I didn't catch if that was me or not. Apologies.
Yes, sorry.
Good morning.
Yes. Yeah, morning.
Okay. Morning. So from IMServe, couple of bits really. So on the positive side, as already been mentioned, the support assistance we got from David and Ian was fabulous. Always on hand, always there to help with queries, etc. So that was really positive. On the what could potentially have been improved, there's a couple of bits from our side. So day one ended up being rerun several times. And certainly I believe that then hindered future execution results when we were trying to get into day 2 and day 3. I suppose I'm particularly talking about the 36s and the 37s where we had the gate closures. So yeah, for me, the rerun of the day ones, maybe in hindsight, what we could have done is just done a full reset at the end of day 1. If there was enough data available, etc., just a whole bunch of new data, because we started trying to change MPANs back to different states, who the loser was, who the gainer was. It got a bit confusing. I'll pause on that one. Okay, on the second part, and it's kind of related. So the reconciliation sheets for the results that we were updating as we were going through the execution, they weren't always right. So the expected numbers that were sitting against the participant, or certainly in our case, wasn't always right. So that caused obviously some head scratching, some time being taken to then go back and see, have we lost something? What's the problem here? So again, maybe for the reconciliation sheets at the beginning, perhaps more time could have been spent looking at those sheets and walking us through them, and also, the caveats that this has been based on functional or whatever it was. But they're the several points from us.
Just on the point in terms of the day 1 having to be run multiple times, and your suggestion that we could have incorporated potentially a data reset following each of those iterations. Again, apologies, I wasn't close to this, but was it technically feasible to do that, or was there a decision made beforehand, David, that kind of precluded that option?
I think a data reset, as in reloading the data for all participants, was seen to be quite time-consuming. And given the limited time that we had, it seems most of the comments so far were referring specifically to theme 2 of the 3 themes, and we're very aware that was the one that we had the most challenges with. And one of the pressures and constraints that we had with that was that we only had this 3-week window in which we could work in SIT B exclusively during a lull in the operational testing. Because of the reconciliation type approach that we were taking, we needed to ensure we were the only ones operating in the environment. If anyone else was doing something, that could skew our numbers and throw off the whole reconciliation process, which, as it turned out, we had other challenges with anyway. And so I think things such as this idea that we could ideally, yes, if we'd had a false start on day 1, that we could reset the data, but I think it was the time constraints probably mitigated against us having that as a real viable option, as in we would have swallowed up most of our time trying to get every participant to reload their data, and not to mind the amount of effort that would take for each individual participant to actually do it. So I guess that's why we didn't go that option. Obviously, if we had a bit more time, that would probably be something that would be a bit more viable. So again, perhaps this feeds into this larger idea of that we ended up having to make certain decisions based on time constraints, whereas for future projects, you'd probably want to try and eliminate those time constraints as much as possible to give you more flexibility around being able to fully consider all potential options.
And the time constraint obviously underpinned by an environment constraint driving it. Yeah. So the fact that whenever you're trying to run testing A in parallel and B, you've got a restricted window within an environment to use, you're going to have these sorts of challenges and you're going to have to make these compromises. So, I think it's an obvious one to pass on to another program, isn't it? That the exclusive use of an environment for the purposes of this test stage and fulfilling the objectives, and also acknowledging that you may hit some delays, is important to uphold from the outset of planning, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, I guess, Julia, regarding your second point then about the reconciliation sheets, yes, as you said, we had based those off functional test flows. Now, as we're aware, and has been discussed in some of the previous sessions, we know that there were some challenges around, accuracy around some of those functional test flows, and some of them were ended up being revised, and perhaps they were revised after we had initially looked at them. Certainly, if we'd had that little bit more time, I guess it would have been useful to bring those to all of the participants in advance of us actually commencing the execution and getting participants' input. As you are the specific experts in the areas that we were exercising, and certainly as soon as we started to look at some of the numbers, yes, there were a few areas where we realized that with input from individual participants that actually, okay, we'd expected this number to be X and actually it was Y. I certainly think that we tried to work as collaboratively as possible to rectify those issues on the fly so they didn't become significant blockers. But I can appreciate there were moments of, as you said, perhaps confusion regarding why certain numbers were a certain way until we'd actually come to that mutual understanding. Again, time constraints, I suppose. If we'd had a bit more, a bit more time to consider the approach and go through a bit more of an internal review process in advance. So perhaps that's something to take to future activities, that if we are going to be doing a reconciliation type approach, that the models should be reviewed with all participants in advance of engaging in the process itself.
Thanks, David. Richard, hi.
Hi, Dom. This is probably a more generic comment than just an NFT thing, but Joe and David touched on this in the first comment, that consequential things were happening as we were doing testing. So we were trying to do A, B, and C, and for some reason X and Y happened, and that could lead to defects or take us down a rabbit hole in respect of the test that we were actually doing. But I think generally across the program, that obviously wasn't an NFT specific thing. That happened across tests in lots of places. And I would probably guess that around half the defects we raised were probably ones like that. They weren't actually about the testing question. They were things that occurred unexpectedly. Mm-hmm. And that's not a bad thing to be finding in SIT. Obviously, clearly we wanted to find those. But I don't feel the attention was really, or the focus or the guidance was really properly there on all of us because clearly you would have wanted us to find those. There was a benefit to finding those and getting them logged. And I guess generally I just feel it wasn't and shouldn't have been just a focus on the test in hand. It was if this consequential thing is happening because you're running this process, then we need to know about that. And I guess just the program guidance and support around that should have been encouraging people to look for those and find those and report those, because I bet it happened more than was probably really reported in some cases.
So I'm just trying to be clear that I understand your point here. So are you saying that with parallel activity going on across, let's say, the environment with different participants doing different things at different times, all at the same time, that created a confusion? And perhaps if we were focusing on tests in a more isolated fashion before we moved into just everyone running everything and getting as much breadth of coverage early on, we would have had less of a problem. Is that what you're saying, or am I not understanding your point?
Partially, but it's not. It wasn't just a case that because here in NFT, for example, we were all doing the same thing at the same time, but just generally, say if a test said send if21s and we sent if21s but then we were getting pub 14s back to reject them, but that wasn't a part of the test. That was kind of been overlooked and ignored in places, even though that's clearly, well, there's an issue there on one of the parties. Either Helix was sending a pub 14 or the data service was sending invalid 21s. But because the test was so structured in terms of, well, you need to send if 21s and then that's the end of the test.
I mean, as a program, we did encourage all participants to raise a defect if anything unexpected happened. But are you saying that you didn't see that happen all the time?
I don't think that happened all the time, and yeah, we tried to do that, and I don't feel personally, I didn't hear the comms that was saying that, so I may have missed that. But that was my general comment, really. Just it stood out from what was said at the start about.
What do you think the recommendation for future programs would be on that point? Would it be to strongly encourage any unexpected event to be raised as a defect? Yeah, more strongly. Okay.
Yeah, the test script is not just what we're looking to resolve here in each test. It's everything around it as well, about the whole ecosystem, really, of everything.
All right, thanks for that, Richard. Any other points?
Not for now.
No. Okay, thanks. Hi, Lee.
Hi, Dom. Another generic comment, and really for me, it would be number one in your blueprint for subsequent industry programs in terms of importance to non-functional testing, or non-functional, full stop, is the importance around having clear and unambiguous, having clear and unambiguous non-functional requirements at the start. I don't think this program has it. The program's never had it. It's made the LDP's job to work out what needs to be done difficult. It's made the industry's understanding of what needs to be done difficult. I think it's driven confusion in terms of what we've tried to achieve in test activities. I think it's been confusing as to when decisions are made and changes of directions have been made in the test program, and we're still sat today talking about are we really sure that's the right thing, and we weren't sure that when we made that change that was appropriate. We talk about or the clarification of requirements, which the non-functional test working group had to try and work out over a course of a number of months, was needed because of the lack of clarity in our requirements. We started to introduce things like recovery point objective and recovery time objective, really clear and ambiguous terms in non-functional space, but they're not mentioned in the requirements. So again, RTOs and RPOs were based on interpretations of words within, ambiguous words within the requirements. So in terms of a blueprint, I think next program has to have clear, unambiguous non-functional requirements and sets the rules for everything and everybody, and every decision is made goes back to those requirements, and life is far easier and simpler to deliver this capability. Thank you.
Sure, and look, I don't think that kind of statement needs any sort of rejoinder, and I think we're all probably in agreement that would certainly make things a lot less painful. But yeah, certainly a strong recommendation to carry forward. For those who didn't see, Dom has just had to drop off now for his PAB meeting, so it'll be myself and Raki going forward. Graham, I think you've had your hand up for a while.
I have been waiting patiently, David, which is highly unusual. I think partly I'm going to reiterate something that Sean mentioned earlier, and also partly what Lee was referring to there as well. So I don't think the goals of NFT were that clear beforehand. I was quite vocal before it started as to what was the value of it. And I think there are large elements that we never tested. I struggled to see the benefit of doing bits of parallel testing. To be honest with you, they might have proved something for the program, and I guess some of it was worthwhile. But in general, I think there are large areas, particularly around performance, and I understand it would have been difficult. But yes, we did our own performance testing, but that's in isolation. At no point have we done any meaningful performance testing with DIP. I don't know what the DIP did with with Helix. I know you had a, theme 1 was about them. I don't know what they actually did. They might have done it volume for Helix, but you add everybody else in, the volumes are significantly more, and doing it across multiple parties at the same time. And I do think there was, if I'm honest, I think there was an opportunity missed. There's a large number of program participants are going through common adapter providers.
Mm-hmm.
And those adapter providers are a key pinch point in the overall sort of ecosystem. And performance testing could have been done with us. I'd put us in that category. We could have done performance testing, and actually, I don't think data is so important there. Whether having data alignment, it's just the fact that there's numbers of messages coming through. So I think there's an element there that was missed. It wasn't tested. I don't know how anybody's got significant confidence that going into production, when we get to eventual full volume, that everything's going to perform properly, because I don't think we've tested that. And then another area was around the certificate. Certificate revocation, certificates being invalid, expired. I don't think we did any of that testing really. It was largely put to one side because we can't get rid of the we can't expire the certificate on the dip, because that would mean that nothing would work. So I think there was areas that were missed that should have been picked up, and could have been picked up with a bit more thought. Which a bit goes back to what Lee was saying about it wasn't really clear what the scope of it was up front. But to be trying to be sort of positive about that whole thing, the NFT team, so yourself and Ian primarily were the people we dealt with, were very responsive, very supportive, very helpful, and that was much appreciated. But I do think there was areas that weren't covered that should be. If you were going to do this program again, you'd look to do those things. I think that they're just fundamental elements of non-functional testing that weren't done, and what we actually did was largely extended functional testing. Anyway.
Okay, well, I mean, I guess if I can address your first concern regarding the fact that you felt the dip wasn't really exercised at volume. So what was actually done for theme 1 was that it was not just the dip and Helix integration. What it actually was full production level volume of consumption messages flowing into the dip, and then being processed by the dip, and then being passed to Helix. So it was that whole, it was going from the input to the dip, as well as the dip's integration with Helix. I guess it was just called dip Helix integration, because that was the main integration that we were testing, but we were starting from consumption messages coming into the system. I can tell you that was absolutely done at production volumes. We were talking 1,600 messages a second. We even did an 8-hour soak test where we achieved 32.5 million consumption messages successfully processed by the dip and passed to Helix, which is actually in excess of the expected 30 million per day that's going to be expected in production. So I think that was certainly exercised at a production-like volume. I do take your point, though, about, okay, but there's adapter providers that would be, in front of that would then be sending those messages in. I guess perhaps for future programs, there is this idea of, okay, well, what's the application scope that you should be focusing on, and should be going, okay, you should be going a little bit further left and working with the adapter providers, so that, let's say we had to build a custom injection tool to inject load at this volume. Perhaps you need to work with the adapter providers so that the injection point is through those systems rather than going straight into the dip. And you could always say you could bring it a bit further left, so to speak. So yes, I think certainly something that could be considered going forward, but I definitely think we can say that there was mitigation against production-like volumes going through the dip itself, even though that was not done from all participants, but it was done using, as I say, this custom injection solution that was built out. And just on your second point about the certificate revocation, I know we didn't do it as part of non-functional testing, but I'm pretty sure it was done in another phase, because I remember hearing lots of talk about tests involving certificate revocation. It might not have fallen into our scope for some reason, but I'm not sure. Is anyone else on this call familiar with activities around that?
It was done in
Ops.
Yeah, Sitox
There you
done the certificate testing. We've done quite a bit, to be honest here.
Yeah.
That was part of Seco 2 test cases.
Yeah. No, it was. You're right. Actually, it was in operational, not in non-functional.
Yeah.
But I don't. Yeah, I don't think it went that far. But anyway, that's my personal view. But
Sure.
Okay.
And look, as with any testing phase, there's always a question of, well, could we have done more? Could we have done more? Could we have done more? But at some point, you need to try and fit the scope to the time, to the program plan, and decide at this point we'll have mitigated enough of X risk, Y risk, and what have you. But certainly, I think the point would always be there that, well, you could always look at, was there more scope that you could have done for non-functional testing? But hopefully my explanation of the actual production level volume testing that was done on the dip, mitigates that main significant risk that you mentioned. And obviously, as we've acknowledged there was actually certificate testing done, but perhaps not to the level of your appetite. But again, it could be something that could be considered in terms of expanding the scope of that for future programs. I think Nigel, you had your hand up, I think.
Yeah, morning. Yeah, thanks, Graham. Graham's just far more eloquently kind of captured what I was going to say. I think the concern that we have is obviously NFT seemed to be, I hate to use the term, but an afterthought. It was a we need to do this kind of now, rather than it having been planned in as a significant piece of work. And I think Graham's right in that, whilst you're saying that there's a concurrency of users hitting the dip adapter, and we kind of achieve that through a handful of flows, what we haven't actually seen is production level flows hitting the dip for multiple adapters. We're one of the parties that Graham mentioned. We are, as ESG, we are a DCP. We will be providing 35, 40 clients access to that webhooks. I don't think we've seen the confidence that says circa 100 parties can hit the dip all at the same time, all with production volume, all generating the flows and getting the responses from the dip. And I appreciate what you're saying, David, is that you have achieved production-like figures, but I question how that was achieved. Was that through a single webhook or just a couple of webhooks, or was it emulating the industry with 100 webhooks being hit? That's where we have kind of a concern around the confidence at that level. Once we open it up and everybody starts talking to the dip and sending and receiving across those multiple endpoints, how is the dip going to react to that point? And I think going back on the point I'm making about this kind of having been a late thought in the process. If you remember, when testing first started, there were a lot of concerns around people being able to hit the numbers just for the initial testing phase. And there were a number of deep dives that went through with the program to deliver this and make sure that parties had sufficient people in place. And my concern around that is that we deep dived around the SIT element, not taking into account the operational and the non-functional pieces as well, and they're considerable pieces of work, and then trying to elevate that back up internally when we've already gone through the conversation with the program around numbers of resource, and suddenly we're talking about different testing aspects that require different resources, and how are we doing this? It just complicated things.
Sure. So, I mean, I guess, if I were to ask you, how would you feel these issues could be mitigated for future phases? Would it be a case of you feel there should be more planning and more pre-consideration going into these NFT and operational phases?
In my head, like Graham said, data's irrelevant. It's more pumping messages to and from. So a separate SIT environment, a SIT-C, or a NFT, whatever you care to call it, a separate environment that we can then point at and just hit it with numbers, and probably have to do some injection work on our side. So the way we designed our injector, that's all sat within our domain, and we've triggered numbers way beyond what the program is expecting. We're confident in that, But again, we've not had that ability to expose that and then use that to inject data at that volume.
Sure. So, I guess in summary, more dedicated environments for NFT and ops type activities, more collaboration with yourselves in terms of direct access to the DIP for doing your own types of loading into it, and kind of more of an integrated type load test but at volume is kind of what you're thinking is something that you're concerned is a gap, which I believe the program has pretty much acknowledged that there does remain that risk going forward. I think it's R1034 that while we've done volume testing and we've done coexistence testing, we have not done coexistence at volume testing, which I guess is what you were alluding to at the start.
Absolutely.
But there is an acknowledged risk that the program is going to be carrying that forward. But from your perspective, you're suggesting that we should really be endeavoring to try and de-risk that in future programs as much as possible.
It definitely needs a different way of progressing it for future programs. NFT probably needs its own thread completely.
Yeah. Okay.
Especially at these volumes, we're talking significant numbers here. So.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that.
Thank you,
Nigel. Sean.
Yeah, I'll change the tone for a small second. Just one piece of feedback from me regarding PIT is linked to the end-to-end guidance document for the test. It was just the number of PIT documents that were expected from the program concurrently at certain points was consuming far more of my time. That meant I wasn't actually doing any PIT work due to the fact that I got functional, non-functional, operational, the different phases. I got the test approach and plan, the bi-weekly reports, the main reports, the RTTMs. I understand that some of that is needed for assurance. What I'm just thinking as the next major program, can you overlay what dates you're asking for what documents to see how many are concurrently happening at exactly the same time? Because I think at one point I was doing bi-weekly reports, RTTMs and scenarios for all four, nearly all four phases at exactly the same time. And therefore, I wasn't doing the job that I'm supposed to be doing, which was PIT. I was spending all of my time doing the documents. So that's just one point from PIT that I wanted to raise.
Sure. I mean, do you think that might have been alleviated by, let's say, a form of some more lightweight documentation, or was it purely just the alignment of activities and them all being concurrent was just putting so much pressure on you?
I think it's I think it was just the concurrency of everything happening at relatively the same time, especially with the date shifts as well, with the different phases. That's it. That's my point. My brain's just stopped working.
So Sean, Rocky here. So just wanted to pitch it. I agree with that. And I can understand why you're saying this. That's because we had to do a lot of documentation because we agreed with the interval approach. So initially, when we did write the PIT guidance, it was all about submitting everything in one go, and then later an approach was taken to break it down into different stages, and there was a lot of overlap. So we do appreciate what you're saying and acknowledge that in future we would look into this and probably see if the overlap is there, try and combine some of the documents or something along those lines.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And Anoop.
Hi, David. So if I start with SIT NFT, I think we have most of our members have raised the points which I wanted to raise in terms of the objective of SIT NFT, which I think from British Gas perspective, we did raise it from day one, or when the NFT working group was formed last year, that we asked why we need a SIT NFT, and obviously you mentioned in large regarding the concurrency, and we even had the bilateral calls just to discuss on the same point to understand what exactly the objective is. But I need to appreciate the fact that I can't remember a program or as industry program before where we had an integrated SIT NFT phase, because that's something which is very difficult to achieve when we have participants participating in a group, and so for that it's a big positive that we had that test phase in the first place. Obviously we have shortfalls in terms of how we could have done that particular NFT, especially as rightly mentioned, the concurrency, whether the data were enough in terms of the volume testing, whether we could have achieved a volume testing in the first place having these many participants. So those are, I mean, questions which are hanging. So for the next program, when we really need to achieve an NFT, when we have so many participants, we have to really assert the objective what we are trying to meet, and we have to state upfront that either whether we are going to achieve a volume testing or we are going to see a specific thing, because so that it's not actually a traditional NFT which we are going to see. So that I think that was actually missing from the beginning, and everyone had this doubt that why we need the SIT NFT when we already had this concurrency achieved in SIT A, as mentioned by some of the members on the call. But as I said, SIT having NFT phase with so many participants in itself is a first, which I can't remember where we having such a phase before. So that's a positive. But on the contrary, what we need to have on the upcoming programs, if at all we are going to perform such an NFT in large scale with so many participants, the objective have to be very clear, and we have so that we can inform back to our leadership that why we having such a test phase at an industry level. So that's the only thing which I wanted to call out from SIT NFT phase. Obviously, the next one, I think the takeaway on SIT NFT, and there were subsequent test phases where we had this version control issue. Whenever we move from one environment to another environment, we had that issue, and I think the SIT NFT was basically marred because of the version control issue, and a lot of test data issues were there. So we faced more of a functional defects rather than the non-functional defects, especially in the theme 2 testing, if you remember, which couldn't see the potential which we would like to see in an NFT, right? Because we shouldn't be seeing a lot of functional issues when we actually try to achieve things in volume. So that's one thing which we can take as the lessons learned in the future programs, that we should ensure that the version control are clear. We should stay away from the test data issues, and ensure that whatever volume or concurrency which we are trying to achieve during that phase, that's what we need to focus more, rather than diverting our focus onto functional issues on a non-functional test phase. So that's one take on my SIT NFTs. And if I move on to PIT, the only thing which I wanted to call out in PIT is, obviously there was enormous amount of documentation that were required for PIT, and obviously the team has taken pain in terms of preparing the documentation and getting it done. The only feedback on that is the timely response of feedback which we expected to receive, that was slightly getting delayed, because we were aware that the program was bombarded with a lot of documentation from all the participants, and we were running behind schedule in terms of giving the feedback. But for future programs, I think we need to manage it better, so that the feedback, because we were looking for that feedback, and we need to understand that if we have any gaps in terms of the PIT which we were doing, and if it were, and I do remember the statement which we received in the feedback that, okay, we have given this feedback at the moment, but you can take care of any shortfalls in the future PIT phases you perform, which isn't what we are expecting to do. Basically, we wanted to clear all the shortfalls of that specific PIT phase then and there. So the earlier we get the feedback for future programs, the better it would be. So that's another takeaway for me for PIT.
Yeah, thank you on that. Yeah, we'll take that away and apply that in future programs as well. We've only got about 10 minutes or so. Is there any more for PIT?
Or any other topic, as you know, as Dom said, we're pretty informal about, you know, if you've thought of something from one of the earlier sessions that you would like to raise at this point, you know, we can account for it in this session. We're not being rigid about the topics. But equally, if no one has anything else to add at this point in time, you know, we can end early and give you some time back. There is, of course, the op session later on this afternoon as well, where you'll be able to raise further conversation topics too. Not seeing any hands up. Last calls. Any further points that anyone wants to make at this point on NFT PIT or any other topic at this point? Nope, not seeing anything from anyone. In which case, I'm happy to wrap it there, I suppose. Thank you, everybody, very much for your input. As Dom mentioned, the recordings and transcripts of these sessions will be being circulated to all participants, so you'll be free to review them after the fact as well. Thanks all for your time. We will see you in the op session later this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.